Back in 1964, a single televised speech did something pretty remarkable. It didn't just support a presidential candidate, it basically launched a political movement. And the speaker? Well, he wasn't some seasoned politician. He was a Hollywood actor named Ronald Reagan. The speech was called A Time for Choosing, but it got so famous that people just started calling it the speech. It really laid the groundwork for what we think of as the modern conservative movement in America.
So Reagan doesn't kick things off with boring policy or a bunch of statistics. Nope. He starts with a story, and a really powerful one at that. He talks about a friend of his speaking with a refugee who had just escaped from Castro's Cuba. And when the American mentioned how lucky he was, the refugee's answer was just chilling. How lucky you are. I had someplace to escape to. That one sentence, man, it cuts right to the heart of Reagan's entire argument and sets these incredibly high stakes right from the get-go.
And that's what the stakes are. For Reagan, this isn't just about some election. He frames this moment as a full-blown existential crisis. See, the Cuban refugee had America to run to, but if freedom is lost here, in the United States, where else is there to go? This idea that America is the world's last bastion of freedom becomes the engine behind every single point he's about to make.
Okay, so to frame this huge choice, Reagan does something that's, rhetorically brilliant. He totally sidesteps the usual political labels. He basically tells his audience to forget about left versus right. He argues those terms completely miss the point. The real choice, he insists, is something way more fundamental. And this is his new framework. He presents two very clear, very distinct paths. The choice isn't left or right, it's up or down. The path up leads to what he calls man's age-old dream, which is just maximum individual freedom, but with law and order. The path down, on the other hand, leads to what he calls, pretty chillingly, the ant heap of totalitarianism. It's a stark, powerful comparison designed to make you feel like there's no middle ground at all.
So who exactly is leading the country down this path, in Reagan's view? Well, he argues it's anyone who's willing to trade away freedom for the promise of security from the government. He makes this really concrete by taking a shot at the policies of the time, specifically President Johnson's Great Society programs. He's suggesting that even with their good intentions, they're actually paving that dangerous road down.
Now, according to Reagan, this downward path isn't some accident. He claims it's being steered by a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital. And this is really his core argument against centralized power. This idea that a small group of so-called experts thinks they can plan our lives better than we can for ourselves.
And Reagan pens a whole set of what he sees as dangerous ideas on this elite. He says they believe the whole profit motive is outdated, that the Cold War can be won by compromising with socialism, and, this is a big one, that the U.S. Constitution is an antiquated document that needs to be pushed aside so the government can do whatever it knows is best.
And here's Reagan's counterargument. He grounds it in the principles of the Founding Fathers. He argues that once a government starts controlling the economy, it inevitably starts controlling people, and that requires force. He says the founders knew this, and that's exactly why they tried so hard to limit the government's power. They believe the private sector is almost always going to be more efficient and economical.
So, to bring this big, high-level philosophy down to earth, Reagan zooms in on one very specific, very controversial policy area, the welfare system. He claims that even after decades of government spending, the problem of poverty is actually getting worse, not better. And he decides he's going to prove it, not with some complex theory, but with simple, powerful arithmetic. And just like he did at the start of the speech, he uses a personal story to make a bureaucratic problem feel really immediate and real. He tells this story about a woman who wanted a divorce, not because of problems in her marriage, but because the welfare system would actually pay her more as a single mother than what her husband earned. For Reagan, this was the perfect example of a system with completely backward incentives, one that was encouraging the family to break down.
All right, now for his attack using the numbers. Reagan starts with the big, top-line figure, the total amount the U.S. was spending on welfare programs every year, a whopping $45 billion. That's his starting point.
And who is all this money supposed to be for? He then gives the number of poor families in the country that these programs are apparently designed to help, 9 million of them.
Okay, so this is where his argument about inefficiency really comes into focus. He takes that $45 billion in total spending and divides it by the 9 million poor families it's meant for. The math is simple. That's $4,600 per family. That's enough to lift every single one of them out of poverty. But he then reveals the actual direct cash they get is only about $600. And that leads to his devastatingly simple question: where did the other $4,000 go? He uses one more really striking comparison to drive this point home. He points to a new youth anti-delinquency program that was going to cost $4,700 per person per year. And then he notes, almost like an aside, that you could send that same kid to Harvard for only $2,700. It's a really powerful jab at government spending.
All of this builds up to his famous conclusion. It's a phrase he actually borrowed from Franklin D. Roosevelt, but he repurposed it for his own conservative vision. He brings all the different threads of his argument, individual freedom, the threat of totalitarianism, government waste, all of it together for one last powerful call to action.
And this is the ultimate choice he leaves his audience with. He boils down the entire, complex political landscape of 1964 into this one single question. Do you trust in your own ability to govern yourselves, or are you going to hand that power over to some distant elite, and in doing so, abandon the very ideas this country was founded on?
You know, even though this speech was delivered decades ago, Reagan's framework, individual freedom versus government control, the choice between up or down, it's never really left our political conversation. It's still incredibly potent, and it leaves us with a question that is just as relevant now as it was then. How do these same arguments, this exact same framing, continue to shape the political debates that we're having today?